Hello, this is the fifth in the set of videos on American behaviorism, this one dealing with the work of Edwin Tolman and Clark Hull. Beginning in the 1930s, modified versions of behaviorism began to be developed. These formulations eventually came to be labeled as Neo-Behaviourism. They sought to avoid the limitations introduced by Watson's rather simplistic formulations. The three most important figures here were Edward Tolman, Clark Hull, and B.F. Skinner. Tolman and Hull belonged to the same generation, both being born in the 1880s and producing much of their most noted work in the 1930s and 1940s. Skinner was a generation younger. He was born in 1904, and many of his most well-known works were published from the 1950s through to the 1970s. The Neo-Behaviorists sought to explain the problem of complex behavior. This seemed essential, as Watson's formulations of behaviorism came to be seen as inadequate for examining complex behaviors. Could a bird building a nest, for example, only be understood as behaving according to an elaborate series of stimulus-response links? Or was it necessary to see the individual movements as elements in a larger and meaningful whole? That is, to assume that the behavior had a goal. The philosopher and psychologist Edwin Holt responded to this challenge in a 1931 book in which he argued that much animal behavior had an implicit purpose. But at a time when behaviorism still dominated psychology, his views were not popular. A far more influential response came from Edward Chase Tolman, who spent most of his career at the University of California at Berkeley. Tolman had come to psychology and philosophy through the writings of William James, and although considering himself to be a behaviorist and being most well known for his work in animal psychology, he retained the broadness of vision that he had acquired from his reading of James. Later he was also strongly influenced by the Gestaltists. He was the president of the American Psychological Association in 1937, and during the 1950s became famous on account of his opposition to McCarthyism and his success in a celebrated court case which led to the overturning of the loyalty oath which had been imposed on academics at the University of California. Although influenced by Holt's ideas, Tolman brought a rigorous experimentalism to the question of animal behavior. He is now most famous for his work with rats. He observed that after a rat had run a maze for a few times, it would often pause at a point where it could choose to go in one direction or another, and look this way and that, take a few steps, and perhaps turn back. It appeared to be making a decision before going on. This perception led him to design two experiments, which have had a lasting impact on the understanding of animal learning. In one of these, a rat was put into a maze, and after running around it found a food pellet in the goal box. After a week's training, it ran straight to the food every time. This accorded with established behaviorist conceptions of trial and error learning, leading to the reinforcement of a particular behavior. What was more interesting was the behavior of a second rat, which was also placed in the maze, but received no food reward. Thus, after a week of exposure to the maze, its running remained random. But if a food reward was suddenly introduced, the second rat was able to run straight to it on the next trial. Unlike the first rat, there was no trial and error learning, leading to a reinforced behavior. These results illustrated two separate principles. The first rat illustrated the principle that reward does produce learning, but the second rat illustrated the principle that even when there is no reward, there may be latent learning. In another experiment, a rat had been familiarized with a maze in which there were three alternative routes to the goal box. Unsurprisingly, as behaviorists would expect, it learnt to take the shortest route. However, when this shortest route was blocked, the second shortest route was also blocked by the same barrier, and rather than experiment, the rat then took the unblocked route, which was also the longest. For Tolman, this demonstrated that the rat had built up some sort of mental map of the entire maze. These two concepts of latent learning and mental maps have since become an important part of the modern psychology of learning, which is no longer dominated by behaviourist ideas. At the time, however, Tolman tried to remain within the behaviourist paradigm. Nevertheless, he was convinced that the rat's behaviour indicated the importance of intervening brain processes, and not just stimulus-response links. Their actions implied thought. He had effectively breached the dike of behaviorism. The most important contemporary response to Tolman's work came from Clark Hull of Yale, like Tolman, a leading neo-behaviourist of the 1930s and 40s. An engineer by background, Hull had switched to psychology after being crippled by polio. He remained convinced that psychology was a true natural science, in which all individual behaviour could be ultimately defined as following quantitative rules. Accordingly, whilst he accepted the importance of primary drives in shaping behaviour, he sought to rebut Tolman and provide more rigorous behaviourist explanations for Tolman's findings. He also embarked on a massive project to express all behaviourist maxims in quantifiable equations in a series of articles in the 1930s, which he later summarized in his enormously influential 1943 book, Principles of Behaviour. Hull became enormously influential, his work forming the basis for thousands of master's and doctoral degrees in the late 40s and the 1950s, such that he was the most frequently cited psychologist of his day. In the long run, however, as the dominance of behaviorism faded, his work was quickly forgotten. Today, every psychology undergraduate is familiar with at least some of Tolman's work, but few people, apart from historians of psychology, know much about Hull. In the next two videos, I will look at the work of B.F. Skinner. Thank you.